Hey, welcome back. In this video, we're going to discuss photosynthesis. Okay, this is a big one. Ultimately, almost all life on Earth, with very few exceptions, completely depends on the process of photosynthesis. Not only plants, which is what we usually think of when we think about photosynthesis, but also animals and other heterotrophs like fungi, many bacteria, other eukaryotes, ultimately rely on this series of chemical reactions to power their metabolisms. All right, so let's first summarize photosynthesis in words and then in the form of a chemical reaction. If we were to summarize photosynthesis, we would say something like this. Photosynthesis captures light energy and transforms it into chemical energy, which is then used to fix inorganic carbon and produce organic carbon-based molecules. If we look at the overall reaction for photosynthesis, we can summarize it like this. Carbon dioxide and water react to form carbohydrates, which we have represented here as glucose, and oxygen. Now, of course, this is a big oversimplification of the whole process, but this is useful when we're thinking about the overall process of photosynthesis. Let's also point out a couple of things. First of all, if I flip the arrow in the middle around, what would we have? Hopefully you answered we would have the overall reaction for cellular respiration, specifically aerobic cellular respiration. So these processes are kind of mirrors of one another. Let's also recall that we're building a carbohydrate. So if we're building something, is it catabolic or anabolic? Well, it's anabolic. So photosynthesis overall is an anabolic process, which means it's going to be endergonic. It requires us to put energy in the form of light. We can also think of the overall process of photosynthesis as a redox reaction. Carbon dioxide is reduced. In other words, it gains electrons to become organic molecules. Water, on the other hand, is oxidized during this process into oxygen as electrons are removed. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on. Organisms that perform photosynthesis include cyanobacteria, unicellular eukaryotes such as diatoms and dinoflagellates, multicellular algae such as seaweeds, and, of course, plants. Eukaryotes that perform photosynthesis do so using chloroplasts, and we'll be focusing on that structure as we discuss photosynthesis. It's important to remember, however, that cyanobacteria also perform photosynthesis. And of course, cyanobacteria don't have chloroplasts. In fact, hopefully you recall that chloroplasts were originally derived from cyanobacteria by the process of endosymbiosis. In a plant, photosynthesis generally takes place in the leaves. How do we get our reactants of this process into the plant? Well, water is generally absorbed by the roots and transported up to the leaves by the plant's vascular system. Carbon dioxide enters the plant leaf from the atmosphere through diffusion. If we zoom in more closely to a cross-section of the leaf, we can see on the bottom here the stoma, which is a pore through which carbon dioxide enters and excess oxygen exits the leaf. The plural of stoma is stomata. We can also in this diagram see the mesophyll, which is the main tissue in which photosynthesis takes place. The mesophyll consists of cells which have many chloroplasts, which of course is the organelle of photosynthesis in eukaryotes. Let's take a closer look at the structure of a chloroplast. Chloroplasts have two membranes. Within these membranes, we find small dish-shaped structures called thylakoids. Thylakoids are stacked inside the chloroplast, and the stacks are called grana, singular granum. Thylakoids have a fluid-filled center called the thylakoid lumen and a thylakoid membrane around the lumen. The fluid-filled space outside of the thylakoids but inside the membranes is called the stroma. And quick note here, I know this sounds an awful lot like a word we just heard, stoma, without the R, which is the name of the pores on the underside of the leaf. I know that's a little confusing, so just heads up to pay attention to those two words since they're identical except for the R, but they mean different things. And let's end our introduction to photosynthesis by saying that the process is divided into two stages. First is the light-dependent reactions, and second is the light-independent reactions, which we also call the Calvin cycle. We can even break the word photosynthesis up into two parts that match the two stages. The light-dependent reactions are the photo part, photo meaning light because they capture light. And the light-independent reactions, or Calvin cycle, are the synthesis part because they synthesize, or in other words, build a carbohydrate. If we had to summarize each of the steps in one sentence, this is how we would do it. The light-dependent reactions capture light energy and transform it into the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. NADPH should sort of ring a bell. It looks really similar to NADH, which is an electron carrier in cellular respiration. And just like that, this is an electron carrier that's really similar in structure. The light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid. Both the thylakoid membrane and the thylakoid lumen come into play here, as we'll discuss later. The light-independent reactions, or Calvin cycle, on the other hand, takes place inside the stroma. And the Calvin cycle uses the chemical energy stored in ATP and NADPH to produce sugar molecules from carbon dioxide. We'll explore these processes in more depth in subsequent videos.